The clinking of champagne glasses died down as Martin, my mother's new husband, took the microphone from the best man with steady, confident hands. He smiled warmly at the crowd of guests, scanning faces with practiced ease. Then his gaze landed directly on me across the decorated reception hall. Something in his eyes made my skin prickle with unease. "To my stepdaughter, Zoe Elizabeth Hale," he said slowly, deliberately, almost savoring each syllable of the middle name absolutely no one ever used. My hand froze around my champagne glass. Even my mother looked startled for half a second before her smile snapped back into place like a perfectly rehearsed mask. "You've grown up just like her," he added softly, his gaze holding mine far too long for comfort. My stomach knotted painfully. Who was her? What did that even mean? Guests laughed and clapped enthusiastically, assuming it was a sweet compliment about resembling my mother. But I could see it clearly. The flicker of something dark and knowing behind his eyes, something that absolutely didn't belong at a wedding celebration. That was the first time I felt like the entire room tilted dangerously under my feet, like the ground was disappearing beneath me. My name is Zoe Hale, and my mom's new husband knew my full name before we ever met. He knew things he shouldn't have known, things nobody had told him. And I was about to find out exactly why, and the truth would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. After the wedding reception ended and guests started leaving, Martin kept looking at me throughout the evening. Not in a creepy, inappropriate way that would make me call for help, but like he was trying desperately to remember something important buried in his memory. He called me kiddo with easy familiarity, told detailed stories about my childhood that I'd never shared with him or even with my mother in recent years. When I finally pulled my mom aside in the bathroom near the end of the reception and asked how he possibly knew about the scar on my knee from falling off my bike when I was 9, she laughed it off. "Oh, sweetheart, he must have heard me mention it at some point during our relationship." Except I'd never told her the real story of how I got that scar. Only my dad knew the truth about that day, about the rusted fence and the dog that chased me, and he'd been dead for 15 long years. I watched Martin across the reception hall, laughing with guests, his hand protectively on my mother's waist like he'd always belonged there. He caught my eye and winked, like we shared some private joke I didn't understand yet. That night, lying awake in my childhood bed in my mother's house where I'd agreed to stay for the weekend, I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that Martin's arrival in our lives wasn't random at all. It felt planned, carefully orchestrated, rehearsed, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment for years and years. While helping unpack boxes after their honeymoon the following week, I found an old photograph wedged deep in Martin's nightstand, drawer underneath some papers. A woman with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, smiling brightly at the camera, holding a baby wrapped in a distinctive yellow blanket covered with white stars. The exact same blanket my mother kept folded carefully in her memory box from my birth 22 years ago. When I showed it to Martin, holding the photo up with shaking hands and a demanding look on my face, he barely glanced at it. "Must have come with the frame when I bought it at an estate sale last year." But it wasn't just any ordinary frame. It was the exact silver frame with intricate engravings that my father had given my mother before he died, the one with his initials carved into the back. I'd seen it 1,000 times growing up in our house before it mysteriously disappeared years ago. "Where did you really get this?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Martin's smile never wavered, perfectly calm, but something cold and calculating flickered in his eyes. "Like I said, estate sale. Why does it matter so much to you?" "Because everything about you matters now," I thought but didn't say out loud. Instead, I slipped the photo into my pocket when he turned away, claiming I needed to use the bathroom. At Sunday dinner 3 weeks after the wedding, Martin made a comment that stopped everyone at the table mid-bite. "Your dad would have been so proud of you, Zoe. Really proud of the woman you've become." The table went completely silent. My mother's fork clattered against her ceramic plate. My younger brother Kyle stopped chewing his food and stared. Martin realized his mistake immediately, his eyes widening slightly. He tried to cover it up, laughing awkwardly and gesturing with his hands. I mean, if I had been your dad, that's what I'd feel. Proud, you know. But it was too late. The damage was done. I couldn't shake the way he'd said it, so naturally and easily, like he'd actually known my father personally. Like they'd had actual conversations about me, about my future, about who I would become. Did you know my dad? I asked directly, my voice cutting through the uncomfortable tension like a knife. No, of course not, my mother answered quickly, far too quickly, her voice higher than normal. Martin moved here after your father passed away. You know that, honey. But Martin's face told a completely different story. For just a second, maybe two, I saw guilt flash across his features before he expertly hid it behind another one of his practiced, perfect smiles. That night I couldn't sleep, replaying that moment over and over in my mind. I started searching everywhere I could possibly think of. My mother's attic was crammed full of cardboard boxes marked private in her neat, careful handwriting. In one dusty corner covered in cobwebs, I found my baby box and carefully pulled out my hospital discharge papers from 22 years ago. The birth certificate was signed by the delivering doctor, his signature clear and legible. But there was another signature at the very bottom, barely legible and smudged with age, that looked like M. Hale. Martin's last name was Hale. My father's last name was Hale too, of course. But Martin claimed he'd moved to our town only 5 years ago, long after I was born, long after my father had died. So why was his signature on my birth paperwork? Why had he been at the hospital the day I entered the world? I took photos of everything with my phone, my hands trembling so badly some pictures came out blurry and unfocused. Then I carefully put everything back exactly as I'd found it, making sure my mother wouldn't know I'd been snooping. That night I couldn't sleep at all. I kept seeing that signature in my mind, trying desperately to convince myself I'd read it wrong. But deep down in my gut, I knew exactly what I'd seen. Martin had been there the day I was born, and he'd lied about it. That same week, I had a vivid dream that felt less like a dream and more like a memory surfacing from somewhere deep and forgotten in my childhood. A man stood beside my crib, but it wasn't my father's familiar face. He was humming a tune I couldn't quite place, reaching down with gentle hands to touch my tiny baby hand. When I woke up gasping and sweating, I realized with horror that Martin hummed that exact same tune when he washed dishes in the kitchen. I'd heard it just yesterday while visiting my mother. At breakfast the next morning, I mentioned the dream casually, watching Martin's face carefully over my coffee cup. I had the weirdest memory last night, someone humming beside my crib when I was a baby, but it wasn't Dad. Martin's face went completely pale, all color draining away. His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "You were too young to remember anything like that," he said carefully, his voice strained before catching himself. His eyes widened slightly, realizing what he'd just accidentally admitted. "How do you know how young I was?" I asked, leaning forward. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair with a loud scrape. "I should get to work, running late." My mother shot me a warning look across the table, shaking her head slightly, but said nothing at all. My aunt called me completely out of nowhere that afternoon while I was at work. We hadn't spoken in over a year since she and my mother had a massive falling out over something I never fully understood. "Zoe, honey, I need to tell you something important," she said, her voice shaking with emotion or fear. "Don't trust your mom's new husband. Please, I'm begging you, just be careful around him." Before I could ask why or what she meant or what she knew, the line went completely dead. When I tried calling back immediately, it went straight to voicemail every single time. That evening, I mentioned the strange call to my mother while she was cooking dinner in the kitchen. She slammed her wine glass down so hard on the granite counter, I thought it would shatter into pieces. "Your aunt has always been jealous of my happiness. She's bitter and alone and wants everyone else to be miserable too." But her voice trembled noticeably when she said it, and her hands visibly shook as she gripped the counter edge with white knuckles. "What exactly is she jealous about?" I pressed, not letting it go. "Drop it, Zoe. Just drop it right now." She turned away quickly, but not before I clearly saw tears forming in her eyes. That night, I lay awake wondering what my aunt knew, what my mother was hiding, and how it all connected to Martin. I spent the next week digging methodically through every single box of my late father's belongings that my mother had kept stored in the basement all these years. Most of it was mundane and boring. Old work files, dusty books, clothes she couldn't bear to donate even after 15 years. Then I found a sealed envelope addressed to my mother in my father's distinctive handwriting, tucked carefully inside his favorite book about carpentry. The envelope had never been opened, the seal still intact. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short, desperate message. If anything happens to me, check the files under MH. You need to know the truth about him. Please protect Zoe. The handwriting was rushed, frantic, completely unlike my father's usual careful, measured script. The postmark on the envelope was dated exactly 1 week before his fatal car crash that killed him instantly. My hands shook violently as I read it again and again, memorizing every word. M.H. Martin Hale. My father had known about Martin, had been worried about him, had tried desperately to warn my mother about something dangerous. And my mother had never opened the letter. Or had she opened it secretly and then carefully resealed it? Either way, she'd hidden it away in the basement and then married the exact man my father had warned her about. That night, a memory from my father's funeral surfaced with startling, painful clarity. I was 7 years old, small and confused, holding my mother's trembling hand while she sobbed beside the closed casket. I remembered looking around at all the sad faces of relatives and family friends dressed in black. And I remembered a man standing alone in the far corner of the funeral home, silent and completely still, half turned away from everyone else. He hadn't approached us to offer condolences or sign the guest book, just stood there watching with an expression I couldn't read as a child. Now, 15 years later, I could picture his face with perfect clarity. The same strong jawline, the same broad shoulders, the same distinctive way of standing with his weight shifted onto his left foot. Martin had been at my father's funeral. Martin had been there when we buried my dad, watching us from the shadows, and my mother had never once mentioned it in all these years. Had she even seen him standing there? Or had he come specifically to make sure my father was really dead and gone? The thought made me physically sick to my stomach. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. I drove to the hospital where I was born the next morning, telling my mother I had errands to run in that part of town. The maternity ward had been completely renovated since then, but I found an older nurse at the information desk who'd worked there for over 30 years. When I showed her a photo of my mother from around that time, recognition lit up her wrinkled face immediately. "Oh yes, I remember her well. Sweet woman. She was here a lot before and after you were born. High-risk pregnancy, if I recall correctly." "Do you remember anyone visiting her?" I asked carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. The nurse thought for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. Her husband came every single day, of course. Devoted man, and his friend, tall man with dark hair, always brought beautiful flowers. Said he was your father's brother, I think, very devoted to the family. My father didn't have a brother. He was an only child, something he'd mentioned many times growing up. "Do you remember what the friend looked like?" My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. She described Martin perfectly, down to the small scar above his left eyebrow that he'd gotten in a childhood accident. When I confronted my mother that evening, she completely exploded with anger. "You're ruining everything. Why can't you just let me be happy for once in my life, after everything I've been through?" "Because nothing about this is normal, Mom. He knew things about me before you two even met. He was at the hospital when I was born. He was at Dad's funeral watching us." Martin appeared in the doorway like he'd been listening the whole time, putting his arm around my mother's shoulders protectively. "Zoe, I understand this is hard for you. You're still grieving your dad in your own way. Even after all these years, let's give you some space to process." The way he said it, so calm and reasonable and therapeutic sounding, made me want to scream at the top of my lungs. I realized in that moment they were a team. Whatever secrets they were keeping, whatever lies they were telling, they were keeping them together. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes as I grabbed my purse and keys and left, slamming the door behind me. But I heard her crying after the door closed, and Martin's low, soothing voice comforting her. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, shaking with anger and fear and confusion. Then I made a decision. If they wouldn't tell me the truth willingly, I'd find it myself. I bought a small voice recorder from an electronics store and hid it carefully under the living room couch cushion the next time I visited for dinner. 3 days later, I retrieved it while my mother was at work and Martin was upstairs taking a shower. That night, alone in my apartment, I listened to hours of mundane conversation about groceries and television shows. Then, around the 2-hour mark, I heard them arguing intensely. My mother's voice, strained and desperate. "You promised she'd never find out. You swore to me this would stay buried." Martin's voice, lower but perfectly clear. "It's not my fault she looks exactly like her. What was I supposed to do, ignore it completely? You should have stayed away from us completely. That was the deal we made." "The deal," Martin laughed bitterly. "The deal was that I'd wait patiently, and I waited 15 long years. I think I've been patient enough, don't you?" The recording ended there as they apparently moved to another room. I sat in stunned silence, playing it back 3 times to make sure I'd heard correctly. What deal had they made? Who did I supposedly look like? And why had Martin waited exactly 15 years? A man I'd never seen before in my life appeared at my workplace the following Tuesday afternoon. He asked for me by name at the reception desk, saying he used to know my father and heard through mutual friends that I worked there. We sat in the coffee shop next door, away from curious coworkers. He was older, maybe 60, with kind eyes and gray hair. "Your father and I worked together briefly at the construction company," he explained. "He was a genuinely good man. I was deeply sorry to hear about his tragic accident." When I mentioned Martin's name, watching his reaction carefully, the man went completely silent. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips, suspended in air. "What is it?" I demanded. "Tell me what you know." He set down his cup slowly and carefully. "Martin Hale wasn't your father's friend, despite what he might have told people over the years. He was his shadow. Everywhere your dad went, Martin was somehow there. Your father tried desperately to get a restraining order a few weeks before he died." "A restraining order? Against Martin?" The man nodded grimly. "Your father was terrified of him, said Martin was obsessed with your mother, following her everywhere. I testified at the hearing, but Martin was clever and manipulative, made it look like your dad was just paranoid and jealous. That weekend, while my mother and Martin were out at dinner with friends, I broke into Martin's home office using the spare key my mother had given me months ago for emergencies. My hands shook as I booted up his computer, trying every password combination I could possibly think of. His daughter's name from a previous marriage, my mother's birthday, my birthday. Finally, on the 7th desperate try, my father's death date. The desktop had hidden folders buried deep in obscure directories. One was labeled Hale Records. Inside were dozens of old emails between Martin and my mother, dating back 16 years to when I was just 6 years old. One email from my mother, sent 14 years ago, made my blood run completely cold. Subject line: "You said it was an accident." Body: "I can't do this anymore, Martin. Every time I look at Zoe, I see what you did. You promised it was just an accident. You swore on everything you didn't mean for him to die that night." I took photos of everything with shaking hands, then carefully shut down the computer and fled the house before they came home and caught me. I called my aunt again, desperate for real answers now. This time, she answered on the first ring like she'd been sitting by her phone expecting my call. "I need to know everything," I said without preamble or pleasantries. "About Martin and my dad, everything you know." She was silent for a long, heavy moment. Then she started talking, and I felt my entire world collapse around me like a house made of cards. "Martin and your father worked together at a construction company 23 years ago. Martin became obsessed with your mother after meeting her at a company Christmas party. Your father noticed Martin following them everywhere, showing up places he absolutely shouldn't be. When your dad tried to cut him off, tried to get him fired and removed from their lives permanently, Martin wouldn't leave them alone. And then the crash, I whispered, my throat tight. And then the crash, she confirmed quietly. Exactly 1 week after your father filed for a restraining order, Martin was conveniently listed as a witness, said he saw the whole thing happen, said your dad swerved suddenly to avoid a deer and lost control of the car. But that's not what really happened. No, sweetheart, my aunt said quietly. That's not what happened at all. I felt tears streaming down my face as the truth finally crystallized. I confronted my mother again the next day, bringing printed copies of the emails and the audio recording. I laid everything out on her kitchen table while she stared in absolute horror, her face going pale. Mom, tell me the truth, all of it right now. She collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably, her whole body shaking. He said it was an accident, Zoe. I didn't know at first. I swear on my life I didn't know what really happened. Didn't know what? That he caused the crash. She was crying so hard she could barely speak coherently. He told me later, years later, after we'd started talking again. He said it was an accident, that he just wanted to scare your father into backing off, that he never actually meant for the car to flip over. And you married him anyway. I felt completely numb, disconnected from my own body. Martin appeared in the doorway. He didn't look surprised or concerned about being caught, just resigned. Your mother needed someone, Zoe. I was there for her when no one else was. You killed my father. It was an accident, he said calmly, like we were discussing the weather. Just like I told the police 15 years ago. I moved out that night, packing everything I owned into my car in 3 frantic trips. My mother called and texted constantly, but I blocked her number. Martin sent messages too. You don't understand what happened back then. Let me explain everything. I didn't want his explanations or excuses. I wanted justice for my father. I rented a small apartment across town and started compiling everything I'd found into organized files. The emails, the recordings, the hospital records showing Martin had been there. My father's letter warning about MH, the witness testimony from the restraining order hearing. Every single piece of evidence pointed to the same terrible conclusion. Martin had killed my father deliberately and had spent 15 patient years working his way into my mother's life, into our family, into the exact place my father should have been. And my mother had let him, whether out of fear or loneliness or guilt or some twisted combination, I didn't know. Maybe all 3 at once. At night, I lay awake wondering if she'd known all along or if he'd manipulated her too. I desperately wanted to believe she was just another victim in this, but the emails suggested otherwise. I hired a private investigator with money I'd been carefully saving for a down payment on a house. His name was Frank, and he came highly recommended as thorough and discreet. Within 2 weeks, he'd found records I never could have accessed on my own. Martin had changed his name twice over the years. His original name, Marcus Hale, appeared in police records linked to my father's crash as more than just a simple witness. There had been an investigation, brief and inconclusive, into whether someone had deliberately tampered with my father's brake line. Martin's name came up repeatedly, but there wasn't enough solid evidence to charge him. Your father's car was completely totaled in the crash, Frank explained, showing me the old police report. But the mechanic who examined the wreckage noted clear signs of recent tampering with the brake fluid reservoir. The investigation was dropped when the insurance company officially ruled it an accident. Because Martin made sure it would be ruled an accident. Frank nodded grimly. He was smart about it, probably wore gloves, left absolutely no prints, made it look just ambiguous enough that the police couldn't prove anything definitively. My aunt gave me my father's journal a week later, a leather-bound book I'd never known existed. She'd kept it hidden all these years, terrified of what Martin might do if he knew it still existed somewhere. The entries detailed my father's growing fear of Martin in painful detail. Page after page of documented incidents, Martin showing up at our house uninvited. Martin calling my mother when my father wasn't home. Martin leaving gifts on our doorstep. Martin following my mother to the grocery store. The final page, written just 2 days before the crash, made me cry for the first time since this nightmare began. If Martin ever comes near my family again, someone needs to tell Zoe the truth when she's old enough to understand. He's not who he says he is. He's dangerous and obsessed. I'm going to the police tomorrow with everything I have documented. I just hope it's enough to keep them safe from him. My father had been trying desperately to protect us, and he died for it. I showed up at my mother's house unannounced with a large box full of evidence. I dumped it all dramatically on their dining room table. The emails, the recordings, the police reports, my father's journal, the birth records showing Martin had been at the hospital. My mother stared at everything, her face completely white. Martin just sat there, surprisingly calm, his hands folded neatly on the table. "You have no idea what really happened," Martin said quietly. "You were just a baby. You don't know what your father was really like behind closed doors." "Don't you dare," I hissed. "Don't you dare try to make him the villain in this story." "I loved your mother long before your father did," Martin continued as if I hadn't spoken. "We dated in college. He stole her from me. Everything I did to get back what was rightfully mine." The cold calculation in his voice made my skin crawl. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was revenge, carefully planned and stretched out over decades. The investigator, without my knowledge or permission, had leaked some of the information to a local reporter he trusted. 2 days after my confrontation with Martin, news broke online about the suspicious circumstances around my father's death being officially reopened for investigation. Martin's past, his multiple name changes, his presence at the hospital when I was born, the restraining order my father had filed, all of it surfaced in news articles and social media posts. My mother's world collapsed spectacularly and publicly. Her friends stopped calling completely. She lost her job when the scandal went public. Neighbors avoided her at the grocery store. And Martin disappeared without a trace. He left one morning while my mother was in the shower and never came back. His car was found abandoned at the airport 3 days later. Police issued a warrant for questioning, but he was gone, vanished. My mother tried desperately to contact me, leaving voicemails full of tears and apologies. I listened to each one once, then deleted them permanently. Finally, my mother wrote me a letter. It came in the mail with no return address, just her familiar handwriting on the envelope. Most of it was explanations and excuses I didn't want to hear, but one line near the end stopped me cold. "He always said you looked exactly like her. Like me, when I was young and we first met. That's why he couldn't stop staring at you at the wedding. He said it was like going back in time, seeing what he'd lost all those years ago." I realized then what Martin's obsession had really been about all along. Not just my mother, but the version of her that existed before my father, before me, before everything went wrong in Martin's twisted mind. He'd been trying desperately to recreate something that never really existed in the first place, and he'd destroyed my entire family to do it. The letter ended with, "I'm so sorry, Zoe, for everything. I was weak and I let fear control me. You deserved so much better. Your father deserved better." Too little, too late. Police found Martin 3 months later in another state, living under yet another false identity. He was arrested and extradited back to face charges, evidence tampering related to my father's death, fraud, and identity theft. The trial was long and emotionally painful. I testified, reading from my father's journal, explaining the timeline of Martin's manipulation and obsession. My mother testified too, finally telling the complete truth about what Martin had confessed to her years ago. In the end, Martin was convicted, not for murder directly because the evidence was too old, but for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The exact same number of years he'd waited to marry my mother. My mother tried to approach me after the sentencing, but I walked away without looking back. I wasn't ready to forgive her, might never be ready. She'd chosen her comfort and companionship over the truth, and that choice had cost us both everything. I visited my father's grave for the first time in years on what would have been his 50th birthday. I brought fresh flowers and my father's journal that my aunt had given me. Sitting on the cold ground beside his headstone, I spoke freely to him for the first time since I was 7 years old. He knew my name before we met because he never stopped watching us, Dad. He was always there in the shadows, waiting for his chance. But I found the truth. I found what you tried to tell Mom. There was peace in saying it out loud to him, to the wind, to the empty cemetery. You were trying to protect us, I continued, tears streaming down my face. And I want you to know that I finally finished what you started. He can't hurt anyone else now. He's in prison where he belongs. A weight I'd been carrying for months lifted slightly from my shoulders. Not gone completely, but lighter, bearable. 6 months after the trial, I released a short documentary titled The Man Who Knew My Name. I'd been working on it quietly for months, interviewing people who knew my father, compiling evidence, telling the story with calm dignity. It went viral within days, millions of views. News outlets picked it up. True crime podcasts dissected every detail, but I didn't do it for fame or attention or money. I did it for my father, to tell his story the way it deserved to be told, to give him the voice he lost. At the end of the documentary, I looked directly into the camera and said, "My name is Zoe Hale. I am my father's daughter, not the shadow of the man who stole him from me. Martin knew my name before we met because he helped erase the man who gave it to me. But I'm taking that name back now. I'm taking my story back, and I'm making sure my father is remembered for who he really was, a good man who died trying to protect his family from a monster." And that finally felt like freedom.